Chapter 11. Paradigms and Facts. Louis Leakey, director of Kenya's Centre for Prehistory and Paleontology in Nairobi, described his discovery, together with his wife Mary, of a bit of skull and two teeth in these words, quote, "We knelt together to examine the treasure and almost cried with sheer joy. For years people had been telling us that we'd better stop looking, but I felt deep down that it had to be there. You must be patient about these things." End quote. The time was July the 17th, 1959. This scene is a curious one on two counts. First, the scientist Leakey knew what he had found before he had examined it. He works by faith and viewed his findings by faith. He was finding proof for a theory already accepted, and he accepted his finding as proof on sight. Second, the intense emotionalism and joy sound more like a revival experience than a scientific analysis. In the same article, author Pfeiffer, himself a true believer in evolution, reports on the intense emotionalism of evolutionists. Quote, "Among those leading the current research boom are adventurers, men with strong personalities and a willingness to spend their lives following up leads and hunches. The spirit apparently goes with strong emotions and feelings, often run high when it comes to interpreting evidence. Criticism is sometimes regarded, and perhaps intended, as a deep personal insult. Not long ago, a professor wrote an article questioning a former teacher in the mildest possible terms about the authenticity of a certain find, and ended a friendship of 30 years. On another occasion, an eminent anthropologist arose to speak at a meeting given in his honor and began reminiscing about the early days of his career when his ideas concerning human evolution had been ignored. But he managed to complete only a few sentences of his talk. Then, overcome by the recollection of years of frustration, he lowered his head and burst into tears. Investigators have stalked out of meetings, indulged in personal vituperation in technical journals as well as privately, argued over priorities, accused colleagues of stealing their ideas. Such behaviour may be somewhat less common than it once was, but it is by no means unknown in other areas of science, but its incidence has been strikingly high among prehistorians. The reason for this occupational ailment is obscure, but it may have been something to do with this shortage of solid evidence." End quote. It is well to have this fact admitted by the evolutionists themselves. Creationists have long known the savage and intemperate emotionalism with which evolutionists respond to criticism of their conclusions or even to critical questioning. Such responses are scarcely the popular image of what passes for science, but they do remain the reality of modern science. Quote, "Its incidence has been strikingly high," end quote, among evolutionists, we are told, and with reason. No area of intellectual or scientific study can dispense with reasoning, but very few areas are ready to face up to the fact that all reasoning is circular reasoning. In many areas, there is general agreement about the particular form of circularity, and hence some general peace to the same degree. In evolutionary studies, where agreement is less general, there is, as a result, extensive conflict. To understand this problem, it is necessary to examine the nature of thought. All thinking rests on pre-theoretical presuppositions, in essence, religious commitments, which condition the nature of thinking. These pre-theoretical presuppositions determine which experiences out of all man's sense impressions shall be regarded as facts. Thus, before there are facts, there are already presuppositions which lead to various beliefs and theories which determine what shall be regarded as factuality. In other words, before there is a fact about facts. As Cornelius Van Til has said, quote, "Facts and interpretation of facts cannot be separated. It is impossible even to discuss any particular fact except in relation to some universal. The real question about facts is, therefore, what kind of universal can give the best account of the facts? Or rather, the real question is which universal can state or give meaning to any fact." End quote. There is no such thing as uninterpreted factuality. Van Til continues, quote, "It is impossible to reason on the basis of brute facts. Everyone who reasons about facts comes to those facts with a schematism into which he fits the facts. The real question is, therefore, into whose schematism the facts will fit. As between Christianity and its opponents, the question is whether our claim that Christianity is the only schematism into which the facts will fit is truth or not. Christianity claims that unless we presuppose the existence of God, in whom, as the self-sufficient one, schematism and fact and reason apart from and prior to the existence of the world are coterminous, we face the utterly intelligible, quote, brute fact, end quote, end quote. To believe that, quote, brute facts, end quote, can add up to knowledge is to believe that zeros can add up to something more than zero. The success of modern science has been due to its, quote, borrowed capital, end quote, because modern science is like the prodigal son. He left his father's house and is rich, but the substance he expends is his father's wealth. In 1939, Van Til wrote, quote, "Thus, the first step that the current scientific method is asking you to take is to assume that the facts that you meet are brute, that is, uninterpreted facts. I say to you, you are asked to assume the existence of brute facts. If you did not assume this, you could not be neutral with respect to various interpretations given of the facts. If God exists, there are no brute facts. If God exists, our study of facts must be the effort to know them as God wants them to be known by us. We must then seek to think God's thoughts after Him. To assume that there are brute facts is therefore to assume that God does not exist." End quote. But in recent years, the older scientific attitude has been giving way to something that seems to be a recognition of Van Til's position. A physicist whose thinking is becoming very influential concedes the circularity of scientific reasoning. According to Thomas S. Kuhn, scientific thinking rests on, quote, paradigms, end quote, on, quote, universally recognized scientific achievements that for a time provide model problems and solutions to a community of practitioners, end quote. The term, quote, paradigms, end quote, he adds, quote, relates closely to, quote, normal science, end quote, end quote. The paradigm is a body of presuppositions which makes science possible, quote. No natural history can be interpreted in the absence of at least some implicit body of intertwined theoretical and methodological belief that permits selection, evaluation, and criticism, end quote. Without these presuppositions, all data are equally relevant and equally meaningless. Quote, in the absence of a paradigm or some candidate for a paradigm, all the facts that could possibly pertain to the developments of a given science are likely to seem equally relevant, end quote. A paradigm is an accepted model or pattern which establishes what shall be regarded as science. It defines both the problems of science and the area of the answers. The paradigm refuses to tolerate data which do not conform to the presuppositions. Quote, mopping up operations are what engage most scientists throughout their careers. They constitute what I am here calling normal science. Closely examined, whether historically or in the contemporary laboratory, that enterprise seems an attempt to force nature into the preformed and relatively inflexible box that the paradigm supplies. No part of the aim of normal science is to call forth new sorts of phenomena. Indeed, those that will not fit the box are often not seen at all, nor do scientists normally aim to invent new theories, and they are often intolerant of those invented by others. Instead, normal scientific research is directed to the articulation of those phenomena and theories that the paradigm already supplies. Perhaps these are defects. The areas investigated by normal science are, of course, minuscule. The enterprise now under discussion has drastically restricted vision. But those restrictions, born from confidence in a paradigm, turn out to be essential to the development of science. By focusing attention upon a small range of relatively esoteric problems, the paradigm forces scientists to investigate some part of nature in a detail and depth that would otherwise be unimaginable. End quote. The paradigm is thus, quote, a criterion for choosing problems, end quote. Other problems are dismissed as, quote, metaphysical, end quote, although they may have been relevant previously. Science, Kuhn says, progresses rapidly because it chooses only those problems it can solve in terms of its paradigm. The paradigm will actually, quote, insulate the community from those socially important problems that are not reducible to the puzzle form, end quote, that is, to the form required for solution by the paradigm. There is no science without commitment to a paradigm. Kuhn speaks, quote, of the paradigm embodied experience of the race, end quote. Man operates in every area in terms of basic presuppositions, and these presuppositions tell him what reality is. Returning to science, Kuhn points out that circular reasoning is used to defend the basic presuppositions. In times of change, quote, each group uses its own paradigm to argue in that paradigm's defense, end quote, with a, quote, resulting circularity, end quote. Quote, the circular argument cannot be made logically or even probabilistically compelling for those who refuse to step into the circle, end quote. In times of change, a paradigm is stretched to the point where a somewhat new one begins to take over. The, quote, two scientific schools disagree about what is a problem and what is a solution, end quote. Paradigms have a priority in all scientific work. Paradigms change only with crises, with a scientific revolution. The reasons for the change, quote, do not derive from the logical structure of scientific knowledge, end quote. When the paradigm shifts, there is also a shift in what constitutes a problem and where the solution can be found. Paradigms, quote, are constitutive of science, end quote, but there is, quote, a sense in which they are constitutive of nature as well, end quote. Does this mean that there is an ultimate degree of God which can be discerned in all of nature? This Kuhn will not even consider. His own paradigm does not permit it. For him, each scientific revolution or change of paradigm is a change of worldview. In this sense, quote, when paradigms change, the world itself changes with them, end quote. Kuhn is not returning to a pre-Kantian belief in an objective world, tempting though that world is. He is clearly a post-Kantian humanist, a scientist who wants science without conceding reality to the world with which science is concerned. The measurements of science are not, quote, the given, end quote, of experience, but, quote, the collected with difficulty, end quote, and laboratory operations, and measurements are, he admits, quote, paradigm determined, end quote. What is their relation to the, quote, real, end quote, world? Quote, but is sensory experience fixed and neutral? Are theories simply man-made interpretations of given data? The epistemological viewpoint that has most often guided Western philosophy for 3 centuries dictates an immediate and unequivocal yes. In the absence of derived alternatives, I find it impossible to relinquish entirely that viewpoint. Yet it no longer functions effectively, and the attempts to make it do so through the introduction of a neutral language of observations now seems to me hopeless, end quote. The sensory experience is itself paradigm determined, as well as the interpretation. Thus, quote, fact, end quote, as well as, quote, theory, end quote, are products of the paradigm, the presupposition. Hence, the thorough circularity of reasoning. Hence the reason, quote, why the proponents of competing paradigms must fail to make complete contact with each other's viewpoints, end quote. Paradigms so govern science that all past science is reviewed and seen in terms of progress towards the present paradigm, and, quote, the depreciation of historical fact is deeply and probably functional, ingrained in the ideology of the scientific profession, the same profession that places the highest of all values upon factual details of other sorts, end quote. What does this all add up to? Kuhn himself calls attention to the fact that, except for the quotation from Francis Bacon, quote, the term, quote, truth, end quote, is not used by him. Evolution is a process, quote, from primitive beginnings, end quote, and that process can be described. Quote, But nothing that has been or will be said makes it a process of evolution toward anything, end quote. Is there a need to assume that, quote, some goal, end quote, has been, quote, set by nature in advance, end quote? On the contrary, quote, if we can learn to substitute evolution from what we do know for evolution toward what we wish to know, a number of vexing problems may vanish in the process, end quote. For many, Darwin's most significant contribution was the abolition of God and purpose of teleological evolution. Is it really necessary to know goals and purposes if such exist? And, quote, what must nature, including man, be like in order that science be possible at all? End quote. This is a basic question, but Kuhn sees no need to answer it. Quote, what must the world be like in order that man may know it? End quote. Kuhn raises this question. As Van Til repeatedly answered, the only possible response leads straight to the ontological trinity and the eternal decree. Kuhn is unwilling to answer the question. He is aware that presuppositions govern all thinking, and that scientific thinking rests on an eternal decree which gives law, structure, purpose, and meaning to all things. The basic paradigm is the eternal decree. But Kuhn suddenly becomes pragmatic in his conclusion, although in reality he always was. Quote, any conception of nature compatible with the growth of science by proof is compatible with the evolutionary view of science developed here. Since this view is also compatible with close observation of scientific life, there are strong arguments for employing it in attempts to solve the host of problems that still remain. End quote. Modern science is thus schizophrenic. It operates on the basis of two mutually exclusive paradigms. First, it assumes the eternal decree, whereby, instead of brute, meaningless factuality, God's law establishes and undergirds all reality. Second, it assumes the autonomy of man as the sole source of law and meaning in a meaningless world. In terms of its autonomy, modern science refuses to ascribe any goal or purpose to the universe, but again, in terms of its autonomy, it can visualize a scientifically guided and created goal. Thus, Dandridge Cole believes that the goal is to be macro life, quote, a new form of gigantic size which has for its cells individual human beings, plants, animals, and machines. This is the kind of society or being which is likely to inhabit the moon and planetary colonies of the future. End quote. In his Politics, Aristotle defined man as a creature of the state, as a political animal. For these new theorists, man is to be less a creature, merely a cell of the scientific socialist state. In other words, the choice is between God's absolute decree and man's absolute decree. By giving us an open choice about the question of purpose in the world, the scientists have given us a closed choice about themselves as absolute lords in terms of their purpose. Kuhn is right. Paradigms, patterns, are inescapable. Man can only live in terms of paradigms. When Moses was admonished to, quote, make all things according to the pattern showed thee in the mount, end quote, Hebrews 8:5, this pattern was simply a reflection of the total pattern and decree in terms of which all things were decreed and made by God, Acts 15:18. This divine pattern or paradigm is denied by the modern evolutionary scientist. As a consequence, according to the Oakland, California Tribune science writer, quote, the relentless juggernaut of science is swiftly shattering the world we know and generating a blizzard of ethical, moral, and legal problems which mankind is already being called upon to solve, end quote. However, it is not mankind but the scientists who feel called to offer a solution. A panel of the 40th annual meeting of the American College of Physicians felt there was no divine paradigm or law, quote, no comfortable absolutes on which to rely in our moral dilemma, but rather that responsible choices have to be made by each of us as individuals as to an appropriate ethic or way of conduct in the ever-shifting confrontation with the realities of our tension-filled lives, end quote. So spoke Dr. Chauncey Leake of the University of California Medical Center. God's absolutes are ruled out, but man's absolutes are ruled in. Quote, responsible choices have to be made, end quote, in terms of our independence and ultimacy, and basically these choices are to be determined by the scientific experts. Thus, Joshua Lederberg, professor of genetics at the Stanford University School of Medicine, feels that God's laws, as they relate to abortion, are, quote, savage, end quote. He denies to God any right to an absolute, even as he, Dr. Lederberg, pronounces one. Quote, we cannot insist on absolute rights to life of a piece of tissue just because it bears a resemblance to humanity. End quote. Take your choice on abortion and all things else. The paradigm, pattern, law, or absolute of God are that of Dr. Joshua Lederberg and his kind. You will live and die in terms of your decision. An Associated Press report states that, quote, mankind stands on the threshold of, quote, playing God, end quote, because of the scientific breakthrough of the genetic code, a Michigan State University biophysicist believes, end quote. Dr. Leroy Ogerstein predicted that this would occur, quote, within 15 years, end quote. We are very openly being given our choice of gods, the God of Scripture, or the new gods of science. And the scientists point to their own, quote, power, end quote, with singular boastfulness. They have no doubts about themselves, however radical their doubts about Jesus Christ may be. The late medieval period portrayed the priests as bloated parasites. It was a cruel caricature in part, but it was effective because it had a strong element of truth. Later, monarchs came in for similar abuse. Again, it was often unfair, but the aspect of arbitrariness did lend itself to caricature and attack. Sinclair Lewis in Elmer Gantry was also grossly unfair, and yet very successful in that he put his finger on the egoism and lawlessness of evangelists. In recent years, the figure of the mad scientist has become commonplace in comic strips, novels, and films. Again, the caricature is unfair and at the same time telling in that it pinpoints the total lawlessness of scientists who have absolutized themselves and have seriously planned the remaking of humanity in terms of their imaginations. Their, quote, dream of reason, end quote, is real, and it is madness. Moreover, it is logical. If men will not accept creationism, they cannot have the sovereignty of God. The revolutionary paradigm which will then govern men will be the, quote, dream of reason, end quote, the paradigms of the autonomy and ultimacy of scientific man. The choice is between God's paradigm and man's paradigm, and men must reap the consequences of their choice. The widespread acceptance of Kuhn's paradigm clearly means that scientists have recognized their religious foundation and they have self-consciously elected themselves as gods.